It's Bethany Barnard. Awake my soul and sing. You're on Vision Christian Radio. It's Neil with you on this Wednesday edition of 2020, and a conversation very shortly. We will open our talkback lines. You will have an opportunity to give your own impression, yes or no, for The Voice and Australia's Constitution. You'll know that we're heading for a national referendum later this year, probably between October and December. We'll be asked to have our say, yes or no, on having a First Nations voice to be included in our Australian Constitution. The Prime Minister says it would be made up of a standing body to advise Federal Parliament on laws that affect the Aboriginal community. The alternative argument says such a move will set a dangerous precedent that can affect the governance of the whole nation. It appears that while everyone wants the best outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, there is a real division as to whether a yes vote may deliver unintended bad consequences for Aboriginal people and create a permanent wedge between Australians. Well, our special guest today is Gabriel A. Moens, an expert in constitutional law. Gabriel A. Moens is Emeritus Professor of Law at the University of Queensland and served as Pro-Vice-Chancellor and Dean of Law at Murdoch University. He's the co-author of a seminal work, The Constitution of the Commonwealth of Australia Annotated. I might make a special welcome to Professor Moens. Gabriel, welcome back to 2020.
Happy to be here.
Gabriel, let's start with something perhaps big picture. Where do you see things standing? Even as we sit here today, where do things stand, do you think, with The Voice nationally?
Well, as you said, Neil, there is definitely going to be a referendum, probably between October and December of this year. In fact, the enabling legislation was introduced into the House of Representatives last week, and the legislation has now been sent to the Senate, where I assume a number of people, including Jacinta Price, will speak against it. The Prime Minister has also announced that $9.5 million will be spent on the education of Australians with regard to the Voice project. Now, in my view, education is a misnomer. It's more like indoctrination, because I cannot possibly assume that the government will make any arguments in favor of the no case. So that is where we stand. The debate is ongoing and it will become fierce.
My suspicion is that people will smell a rat when there is only money that is allocated for a yes case and no money allocated for a no case. And from what I understand, with that money's allocated, $9.5 million, it's sort of into an ethereal type of a fund that really isn't about the yes case, but it's actually promoting the values of the yes case. So,
yes.
So you might say there's something there that looks a little bit sinister because it's not designated yes case or no case. That might be a concerning thing when you're coming to a national referendum where you want people to cast a vote.
Yes, it definitely looks sinister. There have been 44 proposals to change the constitution in Australia. Since 1901, 8 have been successful. Now, on every occasion when there was a successful referendum, both parties supported the proposed change. And in those days, the yes case and the no cases were discussed by all the political parties. People would have received a pamphlet outlining the advantages and disadvantages of the yes or the no campaigns, and people were able to make up their minds as to which way they wanted to go. It would appear that on this occasion this is not going to happen. Indeed, I have been told, but I have not verified it, that people who make a donation to the Yes campaign will be able to claim a tax exemption, whereas those people who donate to the No campaign will not be able to have a tax discount or break. Now, this is unfair if that is indeed the case. It is unfair, and on that basis alone, people, in my opinion, should oppose the project.
because they would feel as though they are not informed appropriately by the incumbent government around an issue of such national significance that there's only funding for one side.
Yes.
When there is only funding for one side, when you smell a rat and you respect the fact that, if there's funding for one side, then that politicises the whole issue, doesn't it? Because the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of Australia are politicised if there's not equal funding. So, and perhaps, some will say, well, isn't that, this is what's been promised by the Labor government. You might assume that the Labor government will fund its own side, but not the other side. But what about this thought about politicising what is happening here, or the politicised outcomes of constitutional change?
Yes, at the moment there are about 300 quangos, Aboriginal quangos, that is bureaucracies, the members of which help Aboriginals in this particular country. And my view is that people who are disadvantaged definitely must be assisted by government. But the point is that in Australia there are so many people who are disadvantaged. That includes Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. If only one group in society is going to receive government funding and government assistance, then the process is definitely politicized. My view is that everyone in this country, regardless of race, should be assisted by the government, and it should not be the case that only people who belong to a certain race will receive preferential treatment. You see, Neil, the problem is, that if the voice were to be successful, then burdens and benefits will be distributed on the grounds of a person's race, which is a characteristic over which people have absolutely no control. It should be irrelevant in our society. We should really establish a colorblind society where all people are treated equally. There must be political equality in this country. It is the only way in which it is possible to unify all different races that live in this country.
You make such a powerful point that seems to be missed in a lot of the debate you might read about or see on your television screens, that what is coming drives a wedge between people in Australia. And,
yes,
if we're talking about a Christian view, the Christian view is that there are not multiple races, there is one race, created, man and woman, created in the image and likeness of God. So the first place that a Christian might start is that if we are one race, we need to be developing, nurturing, promoting a oneness of a people rather than bring about this sort of division. So this sort of division, this is very challenging. And I'm wondering whether, because you've got such a wonderful broad view of history and international history at that, whether this type of referendum or change has been successful anywhere else in the world. Is there anyone else around the world proposing such a thing when you've got this sort of wedge, this division that is going to divide people?
Yes, Australia obviously can learn from other countries. There is definitely one other country where the same system has been tried, namely across the ditch in New Zealand. In 1975, the Waitangi Tribunal was established, which is basically the equivalent, the New Zealand equivalent of The Voice. It started out as a non-binding advisory group to the government, but since 1975 it has been able to arrogate to itself many rights. Now they make pronouncements about taxation, about social welfare, about climate change, anything you can possibly think of. It is very much embedded into the New Zealand society, and they run to some extent the government as well. Now, you may not know this, but 5 members of parliament in New Zealand, or 5 seats, are dedicated to Maoris. So, in other words, the general population can't run for these seats because they are dedicated to, allocated to Maoris. Well, the question should be asked whether perhaps in the future, say in 20 years from now, if The Voice were to be successful, we might have a parliament where, say, 5 or 10 seats will be dedicated to Indigenous people. Is that right? I don't think so, especially considering that at the moment there are already 11 indigenous people serving in the parliament, and they are serving well. Now, in fact, indigenous people are overrepresented in our parliament at the moment.
It is a relevant argument to talk about the number of indigenous people who are in our parliament
Yes.
at the present time, but in the next election cycle, they could all be removed and we could have no indigenous people representing us in the parliament. So does it mean that even though, even if there is a no vote, somehow or other there needs to be some way of putting in place an ability for Indigenous representation at parliamentary level? I know that smacks of the thought of undermining our democracy and the processes that we have. So it's not an easy one to have any resolution for.
No, not. But as I said earlier, Neil, we already have hundreds of bodies, indigenous bodies, that provide advice to the government. And if the voice were to be successful, it would be a mega Kwango, a mega administrative entity, that will be superimposed upon the existing bodies that already exist. You really have to ask yourself the question, will that body, if it were to be successful, will it be able to do anything of a value to the indigenous people? Will it stop the riots and the crimes in Alice Springs? Will it improve education of indigenous people? Will it deliver better health outcomes? What will it do for the indigenous people? Will it indeed promote their life? Will it improve their lives? Not very likely, I would say, because a bureaucracy has a tendency only to look after themselves, the elites, and not the people who actually need to rely upon government assistance.
So when we already have
Yes.
all of these layers of bureaucracy, I have heard the argument that creating a voice to the parliament is simply another level of bureaucracy, and maybe it absorbs people from other levels and makes a super level of bureaucracy. But as you say, there's no guarantees that anything that will be decided or extra funding even filters down into those communities which we might all recognise are in desperate need. And this is one of the complaints, isn't it, from the Aboriginal community? All this money is being spent on Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander issues, but why is it not actually finding its way into communities and helping people right at the place where they need it?
Yes, that seems to be a perennial problem. You mentioned earlier on that it would be a body that would provide advice to the parliament, but we have to ask ourselves the question, what does advice actually mean? Does it simply mean there is an obligation on the parliament to seek the advice of the voice, or does it mean that the voice must actually give advice? If it is the latter, if you were to argue that advice must be given, then the voice would be able to frustrate legislative efforts simply by adopting the convenient device of not giving an opinion at all. Now, if so, one could say that the voice would be able to arrogate to itself a veto power, a veto legislative power, and it would in fact become a third chamber of parliament.
So that would happen, even though that may never have been the intention.
Surely.
The sinister side is that there would be some who recognise that could be an intentional way of bringing change to their own political means. Mm-hmm. So nothing is without some level of controversy in the conversation we are having today. I do want to invite listeners to join into our conversation. And as you can hear, it's a deeper level of conversation than you're hearing most places. You might like to join in. You might be someone who is planning to vote yes. You might be planning to vote no. We're interested in hearing from you today. So our talkback line open on 1-800 316 316. Our very special guest is Gabriel A. Moens, Emeritus Professor of Law at the University of Queensland. He served as Pro Vice-Chancellor and Dean of Law at Murdoch University. There's so many strings to his bow. He's the co-author of a seminal work, The Constitution of the Commonwealth of Australia Annotated. He is an expert in constitutional law, and your opportunity to interact today. 1800 316 316. Back with more in just a few moments. We're talking about the voice. You've got an opinion. You've got an opportunity to have your say and make a contribution to our conversation today. Our special guest, Gabriel A. Moens, an expert in constitutional law. 1800 316 316. Gabriel, let's take a call.
Yes.
Sue is in Kingston in Tasmania. Hi, Sue. Welcome.
Hello, Neil, and hello, Gabriel, and thank you for this program. I've only just turned the radio on, and it's piqued my interest immediately because I have a passion to see things change for the Aboriginal people, having lived and worked with them, and having spent 2 weeks in Alice Springs in November. At the time, they brought 43 additional police in. My concern is that there's not enough knowledge in respect to their spiritual nature, and I'm certainly not one who's got any legal background, but I do believe that given the contentions and the division that exist amongst so many of the Aboriginal communities or clans, particularly here in Tasmania, that if they at least have a voice, it gives them a platform to work from and work forward with. A lot of the Aborigines, or a certain number, are saying they want treaty first, but that could be many, many years before it's possible. I see if they're given a voice, and if we as whitefellas are using some common sense based on the teachings of Jesus and an understanding of our spiritual nature and needs, and given what's happening in so many of the Aboriginal communities where they are turning to God in droves. You've probably heard of the cross that's been erected in the Northern Territory.
Yes, Memory Mountain in the Northern Territory. Very significant thing that's happening with Aboriginal communities there, yes. So
Yes,
let's get a thought or two here for Sue. Gabriel, as you're hearing Sue reflecting on these things, and she's got a lot of thoughts. And what are your thoughts for Sue?
Well, Sue made some very important points. The first important point is that clearly our society should do whatever is possible to improve the plight of Aboriginal people and indeed all people who live in Australia. However, we are living in a secular society at the moment. It is not imbued with religion or religious issues. And that may well be a problem in the sense that it is necessary to look at it from a secular point of view as well as a spiritual point of view. Now, one of the points that I would like to make in this context is that if there is a voice, then the government will obviously have to decide who is going to be a member of the voice. And that is a major issue. I would have assumed that Aboriginal people, or at least Indigenous people, would be members of the voice. But what it means is that the government would have to make a decision, would have to adopt guidelines to determine who is and who is not Aboriginal, who is and who is not Indigenous, Now, that smacks of Nazi Germany, if you ask me, because that is precisely what they did in Germany in the 1930s. They developed guidelines and laws to determine who is Aryan and who is not, If we are going to go down that path in Australia, we will adopt a policy or a strategy which is anti-religion, I think. If Jesus were to be alive, surely he would want everybody to be treated equally. He wants everybody to live in a country where burdens and benefits are distributed equally to all people in need, regardless of race, because race is a characteristic over which we have no control whatsoever.
Just come back to our caller, Sue, in Kingston in Tasmania. Sue, you were mentioning spirituality of Aboriginal people, and there's some division there because there is a sort of an indigenous spirituality that doesn't look exactly like Christianity. It's got a few similarities, but as you say, there are so many who are coming to faith in Christ, even right now. Just any thoughts here from you on what you see as happening in Aboriginal peoples?
Is
Yes,
it
Sue?
I see.
Yeah, go
Oh,
on, go
sorry.
on,
Yes.
go on, Sue.
Thank you. I see that the Aboriginal people come to an understanding of Jesus in a far simpler manner than we do in the Western culture. They have this spirituality that leaves them very open to God anyhow, the spiritual element. And I've come across many Aboriginal people who are thirsting for that truth. And when they hear about Jesus and the gospel message and what God wants on earth for all mankind, they resonate with it immediately and they respond accordingly. And I think we've got such a toxic history with religious falsehoods and with wars and terrible, terrible things that have been going on for centuries. We have to look at the Indigenous cultures generally and look at the lives they had pre-colonisation. So if we use some common sense and some wisdom, the spiritual aspect that's written very clearly of in the New Testament can be embraced. So it brings forward a more united relationship with God, with Indigenous and non-Indigenous, without the shackles of religiosity. And that's what I truly believe is needed.
Sue, you raised some important points around spirituality and even going back to that Uluru statement of the heart, which is where this idea of a voice to the Parliament and beyond that, a treaty, and beyond that, truth-telling, these sorts of things you might say are all one, but we're only treating one part of that too. So a spirituality in the mix is really an important part of the conversation because as Christians, we think that we want to support a spirituality, but actually the spirituality that comes from some elements of the Aboriginal community is very far from Christianity. And there are critics who say, well, that doesn't look anything Christian, that looks more pagan than Christian. And yet we've got this major foundation in Aboriginal communities which is Christian. The conflicts within Aboriginal communities often come between clans and tribal conflicts, and the way they've resolved those over the years looks a little bit more like our Old Testament eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, the sort of, payback system that happens there. So just to come back to our special guest, Gabriel, the Aboriginal community isn't united together. They come from different faith and spiritualities, different clans and tribal outlooks.
Yes.
Thoughts of there being a glowing, wonderful time of their past, not necessarily something that's easily proven. Any thoughts here for how that might look if the Constitution changes?
Well, if you look at Aboriginal history, there were many conflicts in the past between Aboriginal groups and tribes. They spoke different languages and often they were in serious conflict with each other, even of an armed nature. This is a point that is often overlooked. Now, the speaker we listened to seemed to assume that Aboriginal people consist of a homogeneous group. It is not a homogeneous society. There are many groups and subgroups, and some of them may be in favor of the voice, and there are many Aboriginal people who are against the voice, and some of them are sitting in Parliament. When you go to the Northern Territory and you talk to Aboriginal people, many of them have never ever heard about the voice. They do not know what is happening in Canberra. They do not know anything at all. What they are interested in is to receive assistance from the government so they are able to lead a meaningful life which will make them independent of government. That is the best thing we can do for people in general, that is indigenous people and non-indigenous people, to provide them with assistance so as to ensure they are able to lead an independent life, not a life, that is dependent on government handouts. That is what we really should be aiming at.
Is it the case then that if there is no homogeneity about an Aboriginal people, because there are all of these clans and tribes, there is division, as you say, Gabriel, there are some people in Aboriginal communities only just hearing about the voice now. Is this one reason to suspect that whatever body might be set up post a yes win would actually be driven by people who are not as connected with Aboriginal people and culture and the needs as what we might hope they would be?
There is definitely no doubt about that. In fact, you were talking about the Uluru Statement from the Heart. There were some very well-known Aboriginal tribes in Alice Springs who were excluded from the process altogether because they were deemed not to be on the same plane. They were deemed to be against it.
There's in and there's out,
Yes.
even in Aboriginal communities.
Most
We're
certainly.
continuing our conversation after Vision National News. Our talkback line is open, 1800 316 3616. Thank you so much to Sue. We're back with our special guest, Gabriel A. Moens, after Vision National News. Wonderful to have you with us on this Wednesday edition of 2020. If you are just joining us, my suspicion is you're joining into one of the best conversations you'll hear about the voice. You'll know we're heading for a national referendum later this year, probably between October and December. We'll be asked to have our say, yes or no, on having a First Nations voice to be included in our Australian Constitution. The Prime Minister says it would be made up of a standing body to advise Federal Parliament on laws that affect the Aboriginal community. The alternative argument says such a move will set a dangerous precedent that can affect the governance of the whole nation. It appears that while everyone wants the best outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, there is real division as to whether a yes vote may deliver unintended bad consequences for Aboriginal people and create a permanent wedge between Australians. Well, our special guest today is Gabriel A. Moens, an expert in constitutional law. Gabriel is Emeritus Professor of Law at the University of Queensland. He served as Pro-Vice-Chancellor and Dean of Law at Murdoch University. He's the co-author of a seminal work, The Constitution of the Commonwealth of Australia, Annotated. Our talkback line is open on 1800 316 316. We're getting right into the Constitution in just a few moments. But Gabriel, let's take a caller, an anonymous caller, who's been waiting patiently. Welcome along.
Good afternoon. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, I can. So welcome. What are your thoughts?
Yes. Look, I'm coming from a different angle. And for me, it's a very personal matter. And look, I think first of all, I just want to say that, being believers and in Christ, we want the best outcome for all Australians. And I don't see Aboriginal people as separate, although I do realize that there's been a great injustice that has been done against them in the past, and I think they're still suffering a lot. Those injustices need to be addressed, and it needs to be rectified. But I do not think that the referendum will be the right outcome. And I have various reasons for that, and my personal reason for that is that I come from a country, you can probably hear from my accent, but I come from a country that we had a referendum in the 90s, and one of the major problems in our country, I came from South Africa, was race. And all I know is that before we had the first election, we had a referendum where South Africans needed to decide if we wanted to give everybody a vote. And that's totally a different situation than what we're facing now. The thing is that at that time, most of the South Africans did agree that the apartheid laws was not fair, and we did decide that everybody should be treated equal. And being a Christian, that is honestly the way that we should have voted, and I don't regret voting that.
And what you're illustrating here is that a vote like that in South Africa was a vote to actually create a national unity, a level of equality. And we've been talking just in the first part of our conversation about the risk that if you have a yes vote, you'll actually be voting for a wedge and division. Let's bring our guest in, Gabriel Moens. What are your thoughts for our caller?
Well, the argument that has been made was a backward-looking argument. Yes, many injustices have occurred in the past, but it doesn't follow therefrom, that people who are alive today, 200 years later, more than 200 years, should be asked to pay for injustices and crimes sometimes which have been committed by our ancestors. The people today are very genuine. They want to protect the welfare of every member of our society, and they would like to enhance the quality of life of all Australians, including Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. But to ask Australians who are alive today to pay for the sins committed by their ancestors 250 years ago is really a backward-looking argument, which does not enable people to look to the future. We must look to the future, and if we look at the future, we know that we have to be unified as a people. We have to treat people well, regardless of their race, because it is a characteristic over which people have no control. Burdens and benefits should be distributed without regard to a person's race. There must be political equality in this country, and if we achieve that, that is the best thing that we can do, not only for non-Indigenous people, but especially for Indigenous people.
Wonderful, and I want to thank our caller with that South African accent, yes, and raising something very important too, and that is the migrant voice, yes, in this whole debate about yes or no. And I know that listeners can hear your beautiful Flemish accent, Gabriel. The migrant community, they might be thinking, we came here from another country, we're not feeling the same guilt burden that some might be feeling, that, when we start to talk about this emotional level of, people who are victims and how do we make reparations, all sorts of things like that. Coming from the migrant community, how do you think most migrants feel about the yes or the no?
Well, I really don't know, Neil. I can only speak for myself, but I would assume that few migrant people want to be involved in this particular debate. I'm very happy about the caller from South Africa, because even though she is a migrant, she obviously wants to contribute to a very important political debate. And I think that more members of the migrant communities should do that, make a tangible contribution to important societal and political debates in Australia.
Thanks so much to that caller. Our talkback line is open on 1-800 316 316. You might have your own say, whether you're on the yes or the no side. Love to hear from you. 1-800 316 316. Gabriel, let's come to our Australian Constitution. I mentioned you are an expert in our Australian Constitution. You wrote the book. All right. So, I don't build you up too much here, yes, but the sense of a constitution, and like most Aussies, probably my own understanding is not fabulous. Most Australians don't necessarily recognise what the Constitution does and what the intention is, what the Constitution builds in the unity of a nation. Give us your thoughts here around the Constitution and why it may be a dangerous thing tinkering with it.
Well, before I do that, I would like to say that an expert, because you have been describing me as an expert in constitutional law, an expert is a person who knows that he or she knows very little and still have a lot to learn. And that is definitely the case with regard to the Australian Constitution. Now, the Australian Constitution came into effect on the 1st of January 1901. And a milestone was the referendum, Aboriginal referendum of 1967. Of course, I was not in this country at that time, but it was definitely a milestone. Now, according to that change that occurred in 1967, it is possible for the Parliament to make laws with regard to members of any race. Now, prior to 1967, Aboriginal people were specifically and expressly excluded from that particular article of the Constitution. So the Australian Parliament is already entitled to make laws that improve the lives of Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people. And that's a good thing, because eventually that will remove any impediments to getting a job, to getting a decent life. It may be an opening for Australia to develop a color-blind society, which is the ideal we should be thinking of as the future of Australia.
So, in your opinion here,
Yes.
our existing Australian Constitution sets us up to be a nation which is one people, a colourblind society.
Yes, that is my argument.
So if there is change, that creates an opportunity for that to be dismembered.
Yes, I would say that is the case. Of course, the Prime Minister of Australia, Anthony Albanese, has argued that the proposal is only a very modest proposal. In fact, on the 26th of January, which is called by some people as Invasion Day, he said that it is a very modest proposal. To use his language, he said, "This is a modest and gracious request for reconciliation by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people." But, you know, whenever people start to talk about modest changes, they often do not realize that modest changes can have tremendous consequences which are disadvantageous to the country in which we live. And in my view, there will be a major disadvantageous consequences in that it will lead to a divided society, a society of them and us. There will be people who simply have more rights than others. The principle of political equality will be completely dismantled, eroded, and done away with. So there are groups in society that will be preferred, will have more rights than others, and that can only lead to major conflict in the future.
Major conflict in the future, and yet what is promoted with the Yes case, and I'll just reflect on some conversations I've had,
Yes.
where the thought is that if Australians do vote yes, they will be being a blessing to the Aboriginal people, because as I think about these things, and you might remember the movie The Castle.
Yes.
The vibe of it. There's your lawyer who's reflecting on the Constitution and says, "Your Honour, it's the vibe of
Yes.
it." And Aboriginal people want Australians to vote yes, to say, "We're with you.
Yes.
We are your friends. We are not your enemies. We want the best for you." And so there's something sentimental about that, talking about the vibe. But as you say, just reinforcing that just for one moment, what you intend to say, Gabriel, is that if you go down that path, you set yourself up for major conflict into the future.
Well, I do not intend to say that. I do say that, of course. And my argument is a very simple one. Do we want to create a society where burdens and benefits are distributed on the grounds of a person's race? My view is that we should not go down that path, because in doing so we are dividing society into different groups. There are some we will have more rights than others, and that can't be good for society at large. I kind of like your reference to the castle and the rather incompetent solicitor portrayed in that movie. He talks about Mabo, you know. Whenever a question is asked of him, he refers to the vibe, Mabo and more Mabo, you know. That obviously is hilarious, but will ultimately not help us very much in solving the major problems that are confronting us in today's society.
Now, time is short. We've got a bunch of calls. Let's take some calls and we'll see if we can go through some calls fairly quickly.
Yep.
Welcome to Carol in Queensland. Hi, Carol. Welcome.
Hello, how are you?
Very good, Carol. What are your thoughts?
I'm a Christian Aboriginal. I just want to say that I will be voting no, simply because I'm a Christian and I believe for all Australia, Jesus is our only answer, and we need a Christian voice in there for all of us. And I'm all for peace and unity amongst us. But I just also want to say that I also understand, as an Aboriginal person myself, why they want a yes vote. Because it's they need healing. We need to be. We are praying. We're praying for our people because they're still hurting, even though the country says that, we should be we should be all past that, our history and that, and we should be all over that. And, people say to us, look, I didn't do any of that to you. Well, I wasn't born back there either, but I'm in this generation and I still have experienced the result of some of those atrocities that happened back then to my Aboriginal grandmother. I'm actually one of the results. But because I became a Christian and Jesus changed my whole outlook and gave me a complete new heart and attitude and helped me to forgive, that, I can honestly forgive the history of our nation and forgive everything that was done to our people back then. But the yes vote, we need to pray for them for healing. They need to be healed. We all need to be healed of that. And sometimes, we still feel like the reason why they're wanting a voice is because we feel like we don't have a voice, that we're not listened to. And I'll say, even on a personal level, when I talk about my own personal history, people get offended by me and say, you should be over that. You're playing the victim. I'm not a victim. I'm a victorious in Jesus. But I can't, in a lot of cases, I can't share the truth of my history and what happened to me personally. But in saying that, Jesus is the only answer. And we really do need to pray.
Carol, I want to thank you so much. You have shared a heart which reflects the hurt of what's happened in history, but also a recognition that somehow or other, unless Jesus is in the equation, unless there is something of a transcendence above the sorts of things that make us equal together, then there's not going to be any real healing. But that healing, I know that every listener to our conversation right now will be just with you on that, Carol, and just anticipating something that can break through and bring healing for those who have suffered hurt as you have. Carol, thank you so much for your call. Gabriel, do you have a quick comment about Carol's thoughts?
Well, she represents my views very well, I must say. Obviously, Aboriginal people have to be represented in all endeavours of life, and that is why I'm happy that at the moment there are 11 Aboriginal representatives in Parliament. In fact, Aboriginal people are overrepresented in proportion to their numerical strength in society.
Carol, thank you so much for your call. Let's take another call. Dawn is in South Australia. Hi, Dawn. Welcome.
Hi. I just wanted to say something like when I grew up on a reservation where we had to sign permits to get in and out. We weren't allowed to meet in with non-Indigenous people. So I'm not really for the voice because, I believe that it should be just open for all, even Aboriginal people, to be on that government. But it will never happen, even though the professor says that there's 11 people on there, but those 11 people may not live the life that some Aboriginal people have lived, and they're not really talking for us. That's how I look at it. And also, I'm a Christian too. I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. And, without God in our lives, we would struggle, not just me, with anybody in the world. They would struggle. The world needs Jesus. But to say that Aboriginal people argue, we don't argue. just because someone argues, all human beings argue amongst each other, and I find that kind of a racist remark. And to the professor, I am born an Aboriginal. My grandmother was a stolen generation, and she died at 100 years old. And so I'm proud of what I am, but, I just think that the things that you're saying is offending some Aboriginal people. And I listen to the show every day because, it preaches the word of God. And but the thing is, I just think some of your stuff is not right because you've never walked in our shoes. You come from a different country, and I'm sorry, I have to say that. So you'll never understand how we feel. And again, I'm not for the voice because I think that the people that be putting on there doesn't speak for me or my traditional family or anyone else that is out there. So my
Dawn,
vote would be no.
I want to thank you for your insight there. And we will all just pause for a moment and say, isn't Talkback Radio wonderful? Because, Dawn, you get to reflect an Aboriginal voice into a conversation like this. A thought or two, Gabriel?
Well, there are many people in Australia who are disadvantaged in Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, and they have to be assisted by the government. And the government can do that as a consequence of the adoption of the 1967 referendum in the Constitution.
Dawn, thank you so much for your call. Let's take one more call. Gary is in Campbelltown in Sydney. Hi, Gary, welcome.
Yeah, hello, yes. I have a question. It's about the Constitution, but I want to know how it will be affected or whether we'll probably want to rewrite a new Constitution if we become a republic, and how, will they want to rip the old one up and make a new one? And will we still be having the same conversation?
I think we need another 4 hours of Talkback Radio to talk about the Republic, and perhaps today's discussion is not the most appropriate time to do that. To answer your question quickly, no, it will depend on what type of republic Australia would become. We need not necessarily rewrite the whole constitution of Australia for that purpose, but the details we will need to discuss some other time.
Gary, thank you so much for your call. And just before we move on from this point, because that would be a concern of some people who might say, this sounds like a simple, easy, little change to a constitution that may prepare us a little bit like, we were talking about an indoctrination around changing constitutions, having referendums, because of the Republican push that comes from within the current government and beyond, that it may be just something to get Australians doing change a little more easily.
Yes, the Constitution is a very important document for this country. It sets out the ground rules by which we live. And if you start to tinker with the Constitution, that could lead to major upheaval and major disadvantages for people who live in the country at the moment. Now, there is one other point that I should like to make. You have been talking about the Voice being an advisory group to the Parliament, but of course there is also a discussion as to whether it should be giving advice to the executive, and the executive is the government. So if it gives advice to the government, it will be able to embed itself into all governmental executive structures, which leads to a completely new part of the discussion, I think.
And because people on that body would not be elected, it means that you have entrenched ideologies that no doubt would be developed. And even though you might have changing government from the Liberals, the Labor Party, to the Liberals, back to the Labor Party, that entrenchment is going to be there continually and creates all sorts of barriers to what you might hope your elected government is able to do.
Well, I don't know whether they will be appointed. You seem to suggest they will be appointed. That is, the members of the Voice. They may well be elected, but the question is, if an election is called, who will be able to be the electors? Will it be the general community, or will it only be people who are members of the Aboriginal communities? It's very difficult to actually define an Aboriginal person these days.
Well, we do need to draw a close to our conversation, and my encouragement to listeners, when there's a podcast of this conversation, you might want to listen into some of the finer points that have been said. If you came late to the conversation, there were some wonderful things that were discussed early in the conversation, and there may be some people in your own community that could benefit from hearing a conversation like this, and you'll be able to simply cut and paste a link for the podcast and make use of it, because outstanding conversation over this past hour with Emeritus Professor Gabriel A. Moens. Before I let you go, Gabriel, there's so many things that you've got going. You've got books coming out left, right and centre. You've got a new book
Yes.
which called The Foundations of the Australian Legal System.
Yes.
It's only just been released. What would people just expect with that, just very briefly?
Yes, Foundations of the Australian Legal System, History, Theory and Practice. In that book, which I have co-authored with Augusto Zimmerman, a professor in Perth, we talk about the Christian foundations of the common law, and we talk about great jurists, like, for example, Lord Denning, who have contributed a great deal to legal science in general as a judge and as a lawyer. So it is a book that will hopefully be used by law schools around Australia. But it is also a book that could be read by anyone, even though they may not be lawyers. As long as they are able to read well, they would be able to benefit from their reading.
Well, it doesn't sound like light reading for some, but I do know that you do like to write light reading too, and you've
Yes.
written a number of books. You wrote one called A Twisted Choice.
That's a novel.
A novel. You wrote one called The Greedy Prospector.
Yes.
And you've got a new thriller that's coming out by Christmas. Doesn't have a title yet, so I know listeners might like to keep an eye out. Gabriel A. Moens, you can find his books, whether they be deep and legal-oriented or some of these books that are novels.
Yes.
Gabriel, thank you so much for joining us today. I look forward to another update sometime soon, because the Voice referendum's coming. I know listeners will hear you've got wonderful things to contribute, but thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your insight and your heart with us today on 2020.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.